On December 6, 1989, Canada experienced a tragedy that shook its core. It was a day that would forever be etched in the collective memory of the nation. A day when the unthinkable happened, and the country was forced to confront a horrifying reality. A lone gunman, fueled by hatred and rage, walked into Montreal Polytechnic in Montreal. His target, women. This was not a random act of violence. It was a premeditated attack driven by a deep-seated animosity towards women, particularly those who dared to pursue careers in engineering, a field he believed should be reserved for men. This wasn't just an act of violence, it was a hate crime that exposed the dark underbelly of misogyny. The gunman separated the men from the women, making his intentions chillingly clear. The horror of that day was not just in the act itself, but in the ideology that fueled it. It forced Canada to confront uncomfortable truths about its society. The massacre was a stark reminder that gender-based violence was not a distant issue, but a present and pressing reality. It prompted a national conversation about the pervasive nature of misogyny and the urgent need for change. The Montreal Massacre, as it came to be known, wasn't just about the number of lives lost. It was about the potential extinguished. Each of the 14 women who were killed had dreams, aspirations, and a future that was brutally cut short. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and students, each with a unique story and a bright future ahead of them. It was about the potential extinguished. These women were on the cusp of their dreams, ready to make their mark on the world. They were studying to become engineers, a field that was, and still is, underrepresented by women. Their deaths were not just a loss to their families and friends, but to society as a whole. 14 young women on the cusp of their dreams were brutally murdered. Their lives were stolen in an instant, leaving a void that could never be filled. The loss was immeasurable, and the impact of their deaths rippled through the community, the country, and the world. Their futures, bright and full of promise, were stolen in an instant. They were poised to become leaders, innovators, and role models. Their potential was limitless, and their contributions to society would have been invaluable. The tragedy of their loss is compounded by the knowledge of what could have been. The nation mourned with the families, grappling with the senselessness of it all. The grief was palpable, and the sense of loss was overwhelming. Communities came together to support one another, to remember the victims, and to try to make sense of the senseless. This act of violence transcended borders. The shockwaves of the massacre were felt around the world, as people everywhere grappled with the horror of what had happened. International news outlets covered the story, and global landmarks were lit up in solidarity with the victims and their families. It became a chilling reminder of the vulnerability of women in a world where hatred can fester and explode. The massacre highlighted the dangers that women face simply for existing in a world that can be hostile to their presence. It was a stark reminder that gender-based violence is a pervasive issue that affects women everywhere. It sparked conversations about gender equality, gun control, and mental health. The massacre prompted a national reckoning, as people demanded answers and solutions. It led to increased advocacy for gender equality, stricter gun control laws, and better mental health support. The tragedy became a catalyst for change, as people vowed to never let something like this happen again. The scars of that day remain, a solemn reminder of the work that still needs to be done. The memory of the victims lives on in the hearts of those who loved them, and in the collective consciousness of the nation. The massacre serves as a reminder of the importance of continuing to fight for a world where everyone can live free from fear and violence. But amidst the grief and anger, there was also a glimmer of hope. The tragedy brought people together in a way that few events can. It sparked a movement, as people from all walks of life came together to demand change. The outpouring of support and solidarity was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The tragedy ignited a movement. People took to the streets to protest, to demand action, and to show that they would not be silenced. Community meetings were held to discuss ways to prevent such a tragedy from happening again, and to support those who had been affected. Canadians, united in their grief, demanded change. They called for stricter gun control laws, better support for mental health, and increased efforts to combat gender-based violence. The tragedy became a rallying cry for those who believed in a better, safer future. They demanded a safer future for their daughters, sisters, and mothers. The massacre was a stark reminder of the dangers that women face, and the need for society to do better. The calls for change were not just about preventing another tragedy, but about creating a world where everyone can live free from fear. The Montreal Massacre became a turning point, a catalyst for action against violence against women. It was a moment that changed the course of history, as people vowed to never forget the victims and to continue fighting for a world where such a tragedy could never happen again. The legacy of the Montreal Massacre is one of resilience, determination, and hope for a better future. To understand the Montreal Massacre, we must understand the man behind the trigger, Marc Lépine. His story is one of deep-seated anger, a life marred by violence and hatred, culminating in a tragic event that shocked the world. Born Gamil Garbi in Algeria, his early life was marked by instability and violence. The political turmoil of the time, coupled with a volatile family environment, created a perfect storm of chaos and fear. His father, an abusive man, instilled in him a deep-seated hatred for women. This was not just a household of occasional arguments, it was a battleground where his father's rage was a daily occurrence. This toxic environment shaped his worldview, planting the seeds of resentment that would later blossom into murderous rage. The constant exposure to violence and hatred left an indelible mark on his psyche. Lépine's parents divorced when he was young. This separation, rather than providing relief, only added to his sense of instability and abandonment. He moved with his mother and brother to Montreal, a new country and a fresh start. However, the promise of a new beginning was overshadowed by the lingering shadows of his past, but the scars of his childhood followed. The emotional wounds inflicted by his father's abuse and the subsequent divorce were deep and unhealed. He struggled to fit in, battling feelings of inadequacy and anger. The cultural and language barriers in a new country only exacerbated his sense of isolation. His academic performance suffered, and he bounced between schools, never finding his place. Each new school was a fresh reminder of his failures and his inability to connect with others. As Lépine grew older, his resentment towards women intensified. This was not a sudden development but a gradual buildup of years of frustration and anger. He saw them as the source of his frustrations, blaming them for his failures and insecurities. In his mind, women became the embodiment of everything that had gone wrong in his life. He developed a warped sense of entitlement, believing that women owed him something. This sense of entitlement was not just about personal relationships but extended to his view of society as a whole. This dangerous ideology, fueled by his troubled past and untreated mental health issues, set him on a collision course with destiny. His mental health struggles were ignored, and his anger continued to fester. His anger festered, finding an outlet in violent fantasies and disturbing writings. These writings were a window into his dark and twisted mind, filled with plans of revenge and violence. He saw himself as a victim, wronged by a world that didn't understand him. This sense of victimhood was a recurring theme in his life, justifying his growing hatred and plans for violence. In his twisted mind, violence became the answer, a way to exert power and control. He believed that through violence, he could reclaim the power he felt had been taken from him. He began to meticulously plan his revenge, targeting the very group he blamed for his misery, women. His plans were detailed and methodical, reflecting the depth of his hatred and the extent of his resolve. The culmination of his anger and meticulous planning led him to the École Polytechnique in Montreal on December 6, 1989. This was the day he chose to unleash his fury on innocent women, forever changing the lives of many and leaving a scar on the nation. The aftermath of the massacre was a time of mourning and reflection. The nation grappled with the horror of what had happened, trying to make sense of the senseless violence. In the wake of the tragedy, communities came together to support the victims' families and to stand against the hatred that had fueled such an atrocity. Candlelight vigils and memorials were held, honoring the lives lost and vowing to never forget. The massacre also sparked a national conversation about gun control and violence against women. It led to significant legislative changes and a renewed commitment to addressing the root causes of such violence. Educational programs and awareness campaigns were launched to combat misogyny and promote mental health. The goal was to prevent such tragedies in the future by addressing the underlying issues that lead to such acts of violence. The survivors and the families of the victims showed incredible resilience, turning their pain into a force for change. Their stories of hope and healing continue to inspire and remind us of the importance of compassion and understanding. While the scars of the Montreal Massacre will never fully heal, the legacy of those who were lost lives on in the positive changes that have been made. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is hope for a brighter future. The roots of Lépine's hatred ran deep. nourished by a toxic mix of personal experiences and societal influences. His father's abusive behavior towards his mother left an indelible mark, distorting his views on gender roles and relationships. As a young boy, Lépine was a silent witness to the violence that unfolded in his home, a violence that would shape his understanding of power and control. The constant fear and instability in his household created a breeding ground for resentment. He grew up in an environment where aggression was normalized and compassion was scarce. This early exposure to domestic abuse planted the seeds of his future animosity towards women. He grew up believing that men were superior, entitled to dominance and control. This belief was further reinforced by the male-dominated environments he encountered outside his home. In school, in media, and in society at large, the message was clear. Men were the rulers, and women were the subordinates. Lépine's struggles with academic pressure and social isolation further fueled his resentment. He was not just battling the expectations of his family, but also the pressures of a competitive educational system. His inability to meet these expectations made him feel inadequate and marginalized. He felt like an outsider, rejected and misunderstood. His social isolation at school only deepened his sense of alienation. He watched from the sidelines as others formed friendships and connections, feeling increasingly bitter and alone. His inability to succeed in a system he perceived as favoring women only intensified his anger. He saw female classmates excelling where he struggled, and this perceived injustice festered within him. He began to internalize the belief that the world was against him, and women were the beneficiaries of this unfairness. He began to see women as obstacles, competitors in a rigged game he couldn't win. This toxic mindset led him to view every interaction with women through a lens of hostility and competition. He saw their successes as his failures, their happiness as his misery. This toxic ideology found fertile ground in the misogynistic undercurrents of society. He was not alone in his beliefs. There were others who shared his views and validated his feelings. The anti-feminist rhetoric he encountered online and in certain social circles only served to reinforce his hatred. Lépine was exposed to cultural messages that reinforced his warped worldview. The media he consumed often depicted women in demeaning roles, and violence against women was portrayed as acceptable or even justified. These cultural messages acted as a catalyst, pushing him further down the path of hatred. He saw examples of violence against women both in real life and in the media, which normalized and validated his anger. Each instance of violence he witnessed served as a grim reminder of the power dynamics he believed in. It was as if the world was confirming his darkest thoughts. His hatred wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the product of a complex interplay of personal trauma, societal conditioning, and untreated mental health issues. The cluttered desk with personal items symbolizes the chaotic state of his mind, filled with unresolved anger and pain. It was the product of a complex interplay of personal trauma, societal conditioning, and untreated mental health issues. His mental health deteriorated over time, and he found himself increasingly isolated, walking alone in a world that seemed hostile and unforgiving. Lépine's story is a chilling reminder that violence is never a single event. It's the culmination of a long and twisted path. The empty streets and dark alleys symbolize the lonely and dangerous journey he took, a journey that ended in tragedy. His life serves as a stark warning of the destructive power of unchecked hatred and the importance of addressing the root causes of violence.